Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be reading Chapter 5 of my book, The Bridge That Never Crumbles. Chapter 5, The Test of Our Faith and Family. A stroke. This can't be real. I just sat on the hospital bed and clung to my baby boy. On the preceding Tuesday of that week, I was working and received a call from the director at his daycare. He had been sick with multiple bouts of diarrhea. I picked him up and I could tell he did not feel well. My parents called that afternoon and were passing through town. Michael was traveling, so my parents came by and brought Pedialyte and other supplies so I didn't have to get both kids out to the store. Since Grant appeared to have a stomach bug and would be out of daycare, my parents took him home with them so I could work the next day. I called the following morning to check on him, and my mom said he had started throwing up. I called again after work, and she said he was very lethargic and did not want to wake up from his nap. We decided to take him to Arkansas Children's Hospital. Michael had made it back into town, so he stayed home with Molly, and I met my parents at the hospital. As soon as I opened their truck door to get Grant out, he threw up. I rushed him inside and into the restroom. My parents checked him in, and the nurse called us back quickly to take his vitals. We were explaining his symptoms, and she asked us to put him on the baby scale so she could get his weight. He didn't make a sound and just kept closing his eyes. She said that kids his age should be screaming and mad, but not him. He didn't even whimper, and that scared her. She called someone to get him carried back to a room immediately. Within minutes, we were in a room with 6 doctors and nurses checking his vitals, blood pressure, blood sugar, and running other tests. My parents and I just stood there, watching as though it was all in slow motion. They finished the test, and the doctor said he was very dehydrated. They started an IV with fluids. We expected him to shortly perk up, but he didn't. After a few hours of getting fluids, he was still very lethargic, so they admitted him. We got to our room about 4 a.m. We were all tired and, of course, worried about him, but that didn't stop my parents from saying hi and being cheerful to every person we walked past in the hallway. The attendant that took us to the room told me that my parents' positive attitude and words resonated with love and made her want to run home and hug her own kids. What a lesson that taught me, that even in our hardest circumstances we can still share the love and peace of Christ. Once we got settled into the room, Grant fell asleep in the crib, and I laid in the chair beside him. About an hour later, he woke up crying and scared, not knowing where he was. I finally got him back to sleep, and he slept a few more hours. When he woke up again, I just held him. Michael made it there after taking Molly to school. We both took turns holding him the rest of the day. They brought him food and juice, but he didn't want to eat or drink. But the doctor said he had to eat and drink and have a wet diaper before we could be discharged. The IV fluids continued. After a few hours, we finally got him to eat and drink, and he started to perk up some. A little later, he wet his diaper, and we were ecstatic. We were released from the hospital and so relieved. The next day, my husband and I had planned to leave for the Ramsey SMART conference in Dallas. I'm going to derail here and just mention that if you've never heard of Dave Ramsey, look him up. His program to live debt-free is life-changing. Since Grant seemed to be doing better and just had a stomach bug, we decided to continue with our trip. Satan used that decision to haunt me for a long time after that day. But as he always does, what the enemy meant for evil, God covered with his grace and turned to good. We called to check on Grant and Molly every chance we could in between the conference sessions. Grant was really tired all weekend, but doing okay. The doctor said it could take him at least a week or two to return to normal after the stomach bug. We finished the conference and returned on Sunday. We arrived at my parents' house, and Grant was asleep in the pack and play. Michael made it back to the bedroom first, and when I walked in, I said Grant's name. He was on his hands and knees facing away from me and didn't move. That was not like him at all. He typically could not wait to get to me. I picked him up, and I could see the biggest smile on his face, but his body was so tense. I could feel that he could not move. I called the nurses line at Arkansas Children's Hospital. After asking me a few questions, she then told me to call an ambulance immediately. The ambulance arrived, and after just a few minutes, we headed back to the hospital. By this point, his mouth was drooped on the left side, and he just wanted to sleep in my arms. rooms. We arrived and there were no rooms available in the ER, but 3 doctors met us in the hallway and started examining him. A room opened quickly and Michael arrived shortly afterwards. They took Grant back immediately for a CT scan of his brain, and they allowed me to be with him during the test. Once we got back to the room, we thought it would be a long time before we got the results, so Michael left to get us drinks and sandwiches from the hospital cafe. Within about 5 minutes, the doctor came back in. He grabbed a chair and slid it next to the bed. I'll never forget what he said next. The CT scan showed that Grant had suffered a stroke. Did you get that last? The CT scan showed that Grant had suffered a stroke. I started crying and asked him to please wait for Michael to get back to the room, but he said he needed some questions answered as quickly as possible. The questions were related to the past couple days. Even though my parents had taken excellent care of him while we were out of town, I felt like the worst mother on the planet because I didn't know the answers. I called my parents and put my dad on speakerphone so he could answer the doctor's questions. I just laid in the hospital bed holding Grant and silently sobbing. Everything was surreal. Michael made it back to the room just as the doctor had finished the questions. Through the tears, I told him what the doctor had said. My body was numb. I was trying to process the news I had just heard. The next step was for them to do an MRI to get a clearer picture of his brain. We had to wait a couple hours before the MRI machine was available. They advised us that they would have to sedate him for the test, and we could not be with him during that time. I called my parents and sister with the news. They immediately started praying. I also texted our church, and they started a prayer chain. My feelings from horror went to just peace, to truly unexplainable peace that only came from God. I knew that whatever happened, God was in control, and He would carry us through the entire ordeal. The nurse came to get Grant for the MRI and said it would take about an hour. An hour passed, and then another 30 minutes. The nurse called and said they were taking additional images, so it would be even longer. 30 minutes later, the nurse called again and said they were going to do a spinal tap. After what seemed like an eternity, they finally brought him back to the room. The neurologist entered shortly after and said that what the CT scan showed as a stroke turned out to be brain lesions. He had 22 lesions, or spots of swelling, that covered his whole brain. They had to act quickly to determine the cause so they could know how to treat it. It was apparent that we were not going to be leaving the hospital anytime soon. We made it to our room on the neurological floor close to sunrise. Once they ruled out any bacteria as the cause, they started a treatment called IVIG. God used the doctors and the treatment to save Grant's life. If the lesions weren't treated urgently, he could have been permanently paralyzed, gone into a coma, or died. My baby, who I begged God to let live 2 years prior, was now fighting for his life. Even now, as I write these words, tears fill my eyes. The doctors and nurses at Arkansas Children's Hospital were amazing. They jumped into action to determine how to treat him. This occurred in January 2019, so it was pre-COVID. We had friends, family, and church members come visit us while in the hospital. They prayed over us and loved on us. Some brought coffee for us, toys for Grant and Molly, and some their time and encouraging words. It all meant so much. When going through such a trial as this, it is important to have people that can come into your situation and be there to support you. I urge you to find a local church if you don't already have one. Through all circumstances, we should be there for each other, supporting each other. When we lost our baby in 2015, my friend told me that she had never been through that tragedy and had no idea how I felt. But what she could do was cry with me. That meant so much to me. Sometimes that's exactly what we need, someone just to cry with us. It's hard to explain how difficult that week was while in the hospital. Grant started multiple therapies to learn to use his left arm and how to walk again. His mouth continued to droop, so he had to be on a strict diet, and we had to thicken everything he ate. He had also lost the ability to talk. At 19 months old, his vocabulary wasn't huge, but he could say mama, daddy, maui, and he loved talking about his cars. But suddenly, all he did was moan and grunt. God just held us tight during that time. He received IV steroid treatments every 4 hours around the clock that entire week. He also battled horrible bouts of diarrhea, and the steroids caused him only to sleep an hour or two at a time, even throughout the night. After a few nights in the hospital with no sleep, I was completely exhausted. My mom offered to spend the night so I could go home and get some sleep. At first I refused because I did not want to leave him, but then I realized what a gift it was for her to offer, and if I didn't get some sleep soon, I was going to break. I slept well that night when I went home, but I could not wait to get back to the hospital the next morning. As soon as I walked in, my mom told me what had happened throughout the night. Here are her words. I was praying the whole time I was with Grant. He couldn't move much because of the IV in his arm. He was such a sad sight. There were storms that night with angry clouds in the sky. As I talked to God, I saw in the middle of the dark clouds a bright white light that was so beautiful high in the sky. It was in the perfect shape of a cross. I thought it was from a church steeple or a tower. I felt incredible peace in my soul. It was God's way of telling me that Grant was going to be healed. I couldn't stop crying and sharing it with every nurse and lab technician that came into the room. When Monica came in the next morning, I scared her with my crying, but they were happy tears. I told her what God did. We looked through the window to find the church that was displaying the lit cross. The clouds were gone and the sky was clear, but there was no church. In fact, there was no building tall enough that could have displayed that light. It had come directly from God. There was no doubt in my mind it was His perfect assurance of His mercy, grace, and unending love. It's in moments such as these that God, once again, proves His existence and His love for us. We were in awe. Grant continued the therapies as the week went on, and he was making great progress. We found out that the prayer chain for him had made it across the world. We are so grateful for the prayers and support from people we know and from complete strangers. With all the hurt in the world, this type of unity was so heartwarming. On Thursday night of that week in the hospital, we were invited to a dinner for all the kids and the families that were in the hospital. My eyes were open to all the sick and hurting children and their families there. The children with burns, the children with cancer, and many other conditions. Some of the children had been in the hospital for months. My heart broke for everyone there. That was their reality every day. The nurses, doctors, and entire staff made it as pleasant as they could, but of course, nobody wants to be in the hospital. There were also kids all alone. I asked if we could visit the child next door who was all by himself, but was told that was against hospital policy. I understood the rules, but it's sad when rules keep us from loving others as we ought. The next child that moved in beside us was a foster child. His foster mother did not leave his side. One morning we were starting a steroid treatment, and Grant loved to ride in the little red wagon around the hospital. It helped occupy his mind so he wouldn't mess with his IV. It was around 6 a.m. and the coffee shop was about to open. I offered to buy the foster mom a coffee and completely expected her to say no, but she didn't. She said yes, and it made my heart happy to be able to do that small gesture for her. For me, my first response is to say no when someone offers to help, because I don't want to be a burden to them. But it's just as much a blessing to that person to help as it is to be helped. 2 days later, the doctor came in and told us the amazing news that we were able to go home. Grant had made such great progress, he didn't have to continue the physical therapy at the hospital. They gave me instructions on what to do at home to continue to develop his motor skills. We also had to continue to thicken everything he ate and drank. We were sent home with almost 2 more months worth of steroids to continue to heal the lesions and inflammation. Those next 8 weeks were difficult. Those steroids made him not sleep well, and he became angry and agitated very easily. Before that, he was very easygoing. In April, 3 months later, Grant was at daycare and the director called. She said he had woken up from his nap violently shaking. When I got there and talked to the teacher, it was clear he had suffered a seizure. I rushed him back to the hospital. After a few hours, we were sent home with a follow-up appointment for an EEG and another MRI. Praise God, the EEG came back normal. After the MRI, we were able to see the neurologist immediately to get the results. While he was in the hospital in January, we didn't see the images from the first MRI. During that visit, the neurologist showed us a comparison between the MRI in January versus the MRI that day in April. I was stunned. I cried because of the difference. That day, there were 2 lesions left. 2. She couldn't believe Grant's progress. She said that most kids she sees with this condition never walk again. She explained that the lesions remaining were the cause of his seizures because of where they were located on his brain. A lot of emotions came out that day, including empathy and prayers for all the children and families that didn't experience healing. The doctor gave us a prescription for anti-seizure medicine and told us we had to watch Grant very closely. We continued to pray for his complete healing. We were emotionally exhausted. For the next few months, Grant continued to heal, and he had, for the most part, returned to eating normal again. He would still easily choke on liquids, so we had to be careful. He was also relearning to say his words. When he said "Mama" for the first time a few months later, I cried like a baby. I grabbed him and ran downstairs to tell Michael. We were so excited, and it wasn't long until he started saying his other favorite words, although it was still hard to understand him. Grant is now 5 years old and Molly is 12. Grant is still in speech therapy, but otherwise, praise God, I'm amazed and grateful to say he is fully healed. Thank you so much for watching. Please stay tuned for Chapter 6 in a separate video. Have a blessed day.